Hello, my name is Joe Joyce and I'm a solutions architect with SmartBear, and I'm here to talk to you about the Swagger open source tools and some of the reasons that you might want to move from Swagger open source to SwaggerHub. So the Open API specification and the Swagger tools have been helping API teams design and document their services since 2011. The specification itself has become an industry standard, and the Swagger tooling around the specification are also very widely used. So what are the open source tools? So here you see Swagger Editor, which is the Swagger designer, where you will actually design and create the Open API document that describes your API. On the right hand side, you've got Swagger UI, which takes the Open API file on this side and renders it as human readable, more user-friendly documentation. And you'll see Swagger UI used in a very wide range of applications and projects and other sites. And you also have the code generators, which allow you to take the Open API design here and generate boilerplate implementation code out of the design. So if you're doing design first, for example, this can be a very useful way of making sure that your implementation matches your specification. So these three components are very, very useful and very widely used. But sometimes they have their limitations, and organizations need something that is more suited to enterprise level API development. And in those scenarios, they come to talk to us about SwaggerHub. So let's take a look at some of the differences between the open source tools and SwaggerHub. Okay, now let's take a closer look at some of the key advantages that SwaggerHub provides over the Swagger open source tools. So we're looking at the designer view inside SwaggerHub, and you'll recognize some of the components that we were looking at earlier. The editor, the documentation, and your code gen options are available here under the Export tab. Now, what are the differences? So one of the big advantages here in terms of collaboration is that I can invite other team members within my SwaggerHub organization to collaborate with me on this API design. The open source editor really just exists in an individual user's browser context, and there's no way for you to share your API or directly collaborate with another user on that API without sending them the file directly. So with SwaggerHub and the fact that SwaggerHub has organizations, teams, and role-based access control, I can invite other team members directly to my API. We can work on it together. We can use the comments feature, for example, to leave feedback for each other, review the API design before we publish it, and other collaborative actions that make it easier for us to get consensus on an API design before we send it off to be developed. So collaboration is a key difference. Another key difference is the fact that within SwaggerHub, you can have multiple versions of an API. So here, I can have multiple versions of my e-commerce service. Each version will have its own attributes. So an individual version can be private or public. It can be published or unpublished, and these attributes help with creating workflows around your APIs. I can add new versions, and then once I have a new version of an API, I can compare different versions and then decide to merge them if I need to. So versioning and workflow are improved in SwaggerHub over the open source tools. Another key difference is the integrations. So SwaggerHub has several integrations that you can configure for your APIs at the individual API level. The way to think about SwaggerHub is it is a repository of your API designs, and those API designs are very useful technical artifacts that you might want to share with other teams, whether it's development or testing or an API gateway or a documentation portal. So the integrations are what facilitates that sharing of the API designs. The most popular would be the source control management tool integration. So GitHub, GitLab, and Bitbucket integrations are available so that you can keep your API design in SwaggerHub in sync with the implementation of that API in the repository where the code is being written. So we've talked about collaboration. We've talked about integrations. The last big advantage that SwaggerHub has over the open source tools is its standardization functionalities. So what do I mean by that? A lot of enterprises will use SwaggerHub as a way to standardize their API design and development. So to break that down, what do we mean by standardize? We mean make it easy for API designers to, number one, reuse existing artifacts so that they don't have to write API designs by scratch. And number two, make use of API guidelines that they can enforce across their APIs within SwaggerHub. We'll look at that more closely in a second. But first, let's talk about templates and domains. So when you're creating a new API in SwaggerHub, you will have the option to create the API from a template, which is a nice way of getting started more easily and using what might be a common template within your organization. And there's also a feature called domains. So a domain in SwaggerHub is a file that stores reusable components. So for example, if you're in a particular industry or your team wants to standardize what a particular response looks like or what a particular parameter looks like, the best way to do that in SwaggerHub is to put those components into a domain. From the domain, those components can be referenced by other APIs. So for example, you can have a common response for a 404 or a particular type of schema for a country code or some data that is specific to your API design process. Reusability is the key thing here. And that's something that SwaggerHub has that you won't find in the open source. The last feature that relates to standardization is helpfully called standardization, and you'll find it under the organization settings in SwaggerHub. And these are rules, style guides that you can apply to your APIs in SwaggerHub to make sure that they're not just compliant with the OpenAPI spec, but that they're compliant with any internal guidelines that your team might have to ensure that your APIs are being designed in a way that they're going to be easy to use once they're released. I'll give you an example. So we might want to make sure that every operation within our API design always has a default response. That's not necessarily something that will be checked by the OpenAPI spec, but it is something that will be considered good practice for an API. If we turn this rule on here under standardization, and then we set the option that requires an API to pass standardization to be publishable, SwaggerHub will tell us if there are any APIs within SwaggerHub that break this rule. And we can use that information to, for example, prevent the publishing of that API. So these standardization rules have a lot of interesting use cases for automation because they can be accessed through the SwaggerHub CLI as well as through the user interface. And you can also add custom rules if there's something specific to your team or industry that you don't see covered by the out-of-the-box rules. So in a nutshell, the three main advantages that SwaggerHub offers over the open source tools are the collaboration features, the integrations, and the standardization features. And if you'd like to hear about any of those in more detail, get in touch with your SmartBear account manager or reach out and we'd love to talk to you more about them. Bye for now.